These weren't just failed TV shows. Something about them felt off. Not boring. Wrong. Why did so many 1970s pilots with big ideas collapse almost instantly? And what were they trying to do that audiences quietly rejected? Because hidden inside these shows are strange decisions, broken concepts, and moments that don't feel like television at all. And by the end, one of them won't feel like a failure. It'll feel like something that should never have aired. 15. The Star Lost, 1973. At first, it feels expansive. A massive generation ship drifting through space, entire civilizations living inside it without knowing the truth. That idea should feel limitless. But what you actually see feels strangely small. The environments look confined, repetitive, almost empty. And that's where the tension begins to shift. Because instead of asking where this story can go, you start asking why it feels like it can't go anywhere at all. Here's the retention spike. The show is about infinite space, but it feels trapped. And that contradiction never resolves. The characters talk about discovery, movement, purpose, but visually, nothing evolves. Everything stays still. And when a story about exploration stops moving forward, it quietly turns into something else. Not a journey, but a loop. 14. Arc 2, 1976. It begins like a mission, a destroyed world, a small team traveling through it, a purpose that feels clear, rebuild what was lost. But then something starts to feel controlled. The danger never escalates. The environments never feel unstable. Even the threats seem predictable. And that predictability creates distance. What because in a post-apocalyptic world, you expect chaos. But here, everything feels managed. Here's the retention spike. The world is supposed to be broken, but nothing behaves like it is. Even the strangest elements, a talking chimp, advanced tech, don't add tension. They soften it. So instead of asking what will happen next, you start realizing something else. Nothing unexpected can happen. And once that realization settles in, the entire concept changes. It's no longer survival. It's routine. 13. Future Cop, 1976. At first, it looks ahead of its time. A robot police officer working alongside humans. A concept that should create tension instantly. Because machines don't think like people. They don't hesitate. They don't doubt. But here, something feels off. The tone doesn't match the idea. Instead of conflict, where do you get calm interactions? Instead of uncertainty, you get predictability. And that removes the core question the show should be asking. What happens when logic replaces emotion? Here's the retention spike. The most dangerous part of the concept is never explored. The robot isn't unsettling, it's comfortable. And that comfort dissolves the entire premise. Because without tension between human and machine, there's nothing pushing the story forward. So instead of watching a future unfold, you're watching a concept stay exactly where it started, unchallenged. 12. Genesis 2, 1973. It opens with isolation. A man wakes up in a future he doesn't understand. Underground societies. Strange rules. A world that rebuilt itself differently. At first, that creates curiosity. Oh, because unfamiliar systems should create tension. But here, the tension never stabilizes. The world keeps introducing new ideas, new cultures, new behaviors, new structures, and instead of building a clear system, it creates fragmentation. Here's the retention spike. The more the world expands, the less it feels real, because nothing connects long enough to matter. You're not watching a system unfold, you're watching pieces appear, and then disappear, and that creates a different kind of discomfort. Not confusion, but disconnection. The characters move through these environments, but never truly interact with them in a meaningful way, which means the world doesn't evolve. It resets, again and again. And once you notice that pattern, the entire experience changes. It's not discovery anymore. It's repetition disguised as complexity. Commercium 11. The Battlestar Tapes, 1974. This one doesn't start with action. It starts with a question. What does it mean to exist without being human? An android searching for identity should feel unsettling, because identity is unstable, emotional, unpredictable. But here, everything moves slowly, carefully, almost too controlled, and that control changes the experience. Instead of tension, you get observation. Instead of urgency, you get distance. Here's the retention spike. The character searching for meaning never feels lost, and that removes the core conflict. Because searching without uncertainty isn't really searching, it's moving through answers that already exist. The world reacts to him, people respond, situations unfold, but nothing forces him to change. Nothing pushes the concept further than its starting point. So instead of watching identity being formed, you're watching it remain static. And that's where the unease builds, not from what happens, but from what doesn't happen. Because a story about becoming never actually becomes anything. 10. The Norless Tapes, 1973. It begins like an investigation, a reporter documenting strange, unexplained events. That structure should build tension slowly, because information is revealed over time. But here, something shifts too quickly. The mystery doesn't develop. It appears fully formed. Zombies, rituals, supernatural forces, all introduced before the atmosphere has time to settle. Here's the retention spike. The show reveals everything before you have time to question anything, and that removes the need to stay engaged, because curiosity depends on absence. But here, nothing is absent. Everything is shown, explained, confirmed, which creates a strange effect. Instead of building fear, it flattens it. The unknown becomes known almost instantly. And once that happens, tension has nowhere to go. The investigation continues, but the mystery is already gone. So what remains isn't suspense. It's documentation. And documentation doesn't pull you forward. It holds you in place. 9. Planet of the Apes, 1974. This should have felt massive. A world where apes dominate, humans struggle to survive, and every moment carries danger. The original concept worked because it felt overwhelming. But here, something shrinks. The scale reduces. The environments tighten. The stakes feel contained. And that changes everything. Here's the retention spike. The world is still dangerous, but it doesn't feel dangerous anymore, because danger needs unpredictability. But the structure becomes repetitive. Escape, capture, movement, repeat. And once that pattern becomes visible, the tension weakens. You're no longer wondering what will happen. You're anticipating how it will repeat. The makeup is detailed. The performances are committed. But the world around them doesn't expand. It cycles. And that's where the shift happens. From survival to routine. Because when a concept built on chaos becomes predictable, it loses the very thing that made it powerful. And what remains isn't failure. It's reduction. 8. The Man from Atlantis, 1977. It begins with something visually different. A man moving through water with unnatural speed. A world beneath the surface. A mystery tied to identity. At first, that creates intrigue, because underwater environments already feel unfamiliar. But then, the tone shifts, and it keeps shifting. One moment feels serious. The next feels light. Then suddenly, it becomes almost procedural. Here's the retention spike. You never fully understand what the show wants to be. And that uncertainty isn't intentional. It's structural, because tone controls expectation. And when tone keeps changing, expectation collapses. So instead of engaging with the story, you're constantly adjusting to it, trying to understand how seriously to take what you're seeing. And that creates distance, because emotional investment requires stability. But stability never arrives. The visuals remain strong, when the concept remains interesting. But the experience keeps resetting. And when tone becomes inconsistent, even the most unique ideas begin to feel unclear. 7. Salvage 1, 1979. It starts with an idea that feels grounded. A man looks at abandoned space technology and decides to build his own mission, not as a government project, not as a large-scale operation, just one person, one plan, one impossible goal. At first, that creates tension, because the gap between ambition and reality feels enormous. But then something shifts. The process becomes smoother than it should be. The obstacles feel lighter. The risks feel controlled. And that's where the illusion begins to crack. Here's the retention spike. The more ambitious the mission becomes, the less resistance it faces. And that removes the weight. Because difficulty is what makes achievement feel real. But here, progress feels inevitable. Step by step, the impossible becomes manageable. Not through struggle, but through convenience. And once that pattern becomes clear, the entire premise changes. It's no longer about attempting something impossible. It's about watching something impossible become easy. And that shift creates a different kind of disconnect. Because when a story removes friction, it also removes consequence. And without consequence, even space itself starts to feel small. 6. The Fantastic Journey, 1977. It begins with disorientation. A group of people lost, pulled into a place that doesn't behave like reality. An island that connects different times, different civilizations, different rules. At first, that creates possibility. Because anything can happen. But then something subtle begins to happen. Nothing connects. Each new environment introduces new ideas, but those ideas never carry forward. They appear, exist briefly, and disappear. Here's the retention spike. The show keeps expanding outward, but never builds inward, and that creates fragmentation. Because progression isn't just about moving forward, it's about building on what came before. But here, nothing accumulates. Every episode resets the experience. New rules, new threats, new structures, and that constant reset creates a hidden pattern. Not growth, but repetition. Because when nothing carries over, nothing truly matters. The characters move through these worlds, but they don't change because of them. The environments feel different, but the experience stays the same. And that's where the tension disappears. Because unpredictability without consequence becomes noise. And once you recognize that, the entire concept shifts. From exploration to isolation. 5. Supertrain, 1979. It doesn't begin with a story. It begins with scale. A massive, futuristic train, luxury interiors, advanced technology. Everything about it is designed to impress. And at first it works, because spectacle creates attention instantly. But then something unexpected happens. The scale stops mattering, because nothing inside it feels important. Here's the retention spike. The bigger the show becomes visually, the smaller it feels emotionally. And that contradiction defines everything. The environments are detailed, the movement is smooth, the concept feels expensive, but the story never rises to match it. And there's no central tension, no driving force, no reason to stay invested. And without that, the spectacle begins to fade. Because visuals without purpose don't hold attention, they delay it. So instead of asking what happens next, you start noticing something else. Nothing is building. Scenes begin. Scenes end. But nothing connects strongly enough to carry momentum forward. And once that realization settles in, the entire experience shifts. It's no longer impressive. It's hollow. Because scale without substance doesn't expand a story. It exposes its absence. 4. Cliffhangers, 1979. It begins with tension, a moment that feels like it's about to break, and then it stops. The story cuts away. A new storyline begins. A new setup forms. At first, this feels dynamic, because multiple narratives create variety. But then the pattern becomes visible. Every time tension builds, it's interrupted. Every time momentum forms, it resets. Here's the retention spike. The show doesn't fail to create suspense. It refuses to resolve it. And that creates frustration, because suspense depends on continuation. But here, continuation is constantly denied. You're pulled into one story, only to be removed from it. Then pulled into another, only to be removed again. And over time, something shifts internally. You stop investing, because investment requires payoff, and payoff never arrives. The structure itself becomes the problem. Not the stories, not the characters, the interruptions. And once that becomes clear, the entire experience changes. You're no longer watching for resolution. You're watching for interruption. And that's the exact opposite of suspense. Because suspense builds forward, but this structure pulls backward, again and again, until tension doesn't feel like anticipation. It feels like delay. 3. The New Shmoo, 1979. At first it feels harmless. A soft, shapeless creature. Simple design, friendly tone. It doesn't look like something that carries tension. But then the structure reveals itself. Crime solving, investigations, mystery-driven plots, and that's where the disconnect begins. because the visual language and the narrative purpose don't align. Here's the retention spike. The show asks you to take something seriously that visually refuses to be serious, and that creates confusion, not because the story is unclear, but because the tone doesn't support it. The Shmoo isn't just unusual, it's unpredictable in a way that removes stakes. Or it can transform, adapt, solve problems instantly, and that removes resistance. Because when a character can bypass difficulty, there's no tension left to build. The mysteries resolve quickly, the conflicts collapse easily, and that creates a hidden pattern. Not progression, but shortcuts. Because every challenge feels temporary, every obstacle feels removable, and once that pattern becomes visible, the entire experience shifts. You're no longer watching to see how things unfold. You're watching to see how quickly they resolve. And speed, in this case, becomes the problem. Because resolution without struggle doesn't feel like resolution at all. It feels like absence. 2. The Star Wars Holiday Special, 1978. It doesn't begin like a story. It begins like fragments, scenes that don't connect, moments that don't build, a structure that feels assembled rather than designed. At first, you try to understand it, because the world is familiar. The characters are recognizable, but something feels off immediately. The pacing stretches in unnatural ways. Moments last longer than they should. Silence fills space without purpose, and that creates discomfort. Here's the retention spike. You're not confused about what's happening. You're confused about why it's happening this way. And that question never resolves, because the structure never stabilizes. One segment leads into another without transition. Tone shifts without warning. Focus disappears and reappears. And over time, something deeper begins to settle in. Not boredom, disorientation. Because the experience doesn't guide you. It leaves you inside it, trying to find structure where none exists. And that creates a rare effect. You don't feel like you're watching something unfold. You feel like you're watching something struggle to hold itself together. And that's what makes it unforgettable. Not because it fails, but because it fails in a way that feels visible, moment by moment. 1. Battlestar Galactica, 1978. At first it feels like certainty, massive ships, expansive space, a scale that suggests control. Everything about it signals confidence. This isn't a small idea. This is something designed to compete. But then something begins to surface, not in the visuals, in the identity. Because beneath the scale, there's hesitation. The structure feels familiar, the tone feels recognizable, and that recognition creates tension. But here's the retention spike. It doesn't feel original enough to stand alone, but not derivative enough to fully belong anywhere else. And that creates instability, because identity isn't just about what something is, it's about what it chooses not to be. But here, those boundaries never fully form. The show moves between influences, between styles, between tones, trying to define itself while reflecting something else. And that creates a subtle fracture. Not obvious, not immediate, but persistent, because every moment carries weight, but not direction. The stakes are high. The world is large. The threat is real. But the purpose feels slightly out of reach. And that's what makes it different from everything else on this list. It doesn't fail loudly. It wavers between clarity and uncertainty, between originality and influence, or between control and imitation. And that space in between is where the tension lives. Because the show isn't collapsing, it's searching. And the question it keeps asking without ever answering is this: what does it mean to be something when something else already exists? And that's why, at the top of this list, it doesn't feel like a failure. It feels like a moment where ambition reached its limit and didn't know where to go next. What started as strange ideas turned into something deeper, patterns of failure hiding in plain sight. Not bad concepts, but broken execution. And once you see those patterns, you start noticing them everywhere. Because the next time a show feels off, it might not be obvious why, but the reason is always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be recognized.